On mic today, we have Dr. Erin Macdonald. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thank you. How are you doing?
I am doing fantastic. So excited to talk to you here. So I'm going to explain for the people who don't know about you but really should. You are an astrophysicist, an aerospace engineer, and the host of a YouTube series called Dr. Erin Explains the Universe.
That is correct.
Last one is the only one I'm really understanding, so I'm going to...
No worries.
You're one of those people that people like to listen to you talking when they have no idea what you're saying because you're talking about literally what makes the universe.
Yes, yeah.
And what's amazing is you do get very excited about that. You communicate a passion for the knowledge itself, and you like seeking it just for the knowledge. And that's you've got a very state presence too.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I'm definitely passionate about teaching science to the public. I love, obviously, a big sci-fi fan, and so I love being able to use science fiction to teach really complex ideas to the public. And yeah, it's a blast for me.
Okay. So you spent time thinking about the makeup of the universe, and then you go to work and you actually build stuff that flies into the air, and then you decide to take a step to the right and you go on Star Trek Discovery showing them how this stuff works on the back end. It basically becoming almost in the entertainment industry. So you do that because you just like using science fiction?
Well, yeah, I mean, when I work with writers in general, it's usually, yeah, I mean, it's a perfect job for me, basically. Anytime I get to do science fiction consulting is just an absolute blast. So I'm not officially a consultant with Star Trek Discovery, but I talk about the science of Star Trek all the time. Yeah, I was on the cruise last year. I'm going to be on the cruise next year. I was in Star Trek Las Vegas. I've written some articles because I think Star Trek has always played such a big role in inspiring scientists that people say, can watch it and just say, like, I want to live in space. That's cool technology. And then it kind of puts a bug in their head that maybe they can do that and maybe they can get us from point A to point B. Having video chat like we're doing now and communicators and everything is technology that was science fiction back in the 60s. And so what I love is when I get to consult on science fiction, I really take like a yes and approach because I'm not a writer. I'm not great at world building or coming up with characters. It's just not who I am naturally. But I love being able to just say, like, okay, if that's what you want to do, let's try to make the science as accurate as possible. And especially I think these days when we have so much content out there, that really helps a franchise stand on its own two legs because people love that fact and people dig into that. It's like finding an Easter egg, when you learn what science is accurate in science fiction.
And I like how you hit on that there. One of the things I really enjoyed about listening to your talks was that you have a great appreciation for how the science can work and what it does, and you will occasionally just point out places where it doesn't quite work like that in the real world. But you have a great respect for the storytelling process, and sometimes the story does need to come first. And there are other scientists out there, I'm not going to name names, who don't seem to have that sympathy.
Correct. And I know many of them, and I work alongside a lot of scientists who, I mean, when they find out what I do, they outright are just like, man, I can't watch that. My dad's a scientist and he hates science fiction because it does break the laws. But I think when you do find that heart, and ultimately it's the storytelling that draws people in, and sometimes the story has to go first. I think one of my favorite examples is in The Martian, that the air pressure on Mars is not high enough at all. It's 0.6 what it is here, 0.6% what it is here on Earth. And that means if you have wind, it's not actually going to push anything. You're never going to feel that wind. And so it's never going to knock over a satellite that impales an astronaut. And but then we don't have a story,
Right.
So it is a trade. And I do love working with writers to just, I mean, sometimes you do get a challenge where it's just like, okay, this is hard. There's no science in here to justify what you're trying to do. So let's just make it as vague as possible. Maybe we can get away with it.
And if you have to just have literal magic, that's when Q comes in.
Right, exactly. Just, pulling a Q or an orb or profits or whatever, you can make that happen.
So what is your favorite Trek, if you have one?
Oh, yes, I do. So my favorite series is Deep Space Nine. My partner is rewatching it, and he hasn't really ever sat down and watched it from beginning to end. He kind of watched it as it was on TV. And so I love being able to watch it with someone who's kind of watching it for the first time, like knows the stories and obviously sees enough of my talks. He's picked up a lot of that stuff. But man, it's a good show. It is a good series. And we're just started season 4. And The Way of the Warrior is like top, probably my top 10 like all-time Star Trek episodes. But my favorite captain, is Janeway. I just, as a scientist, turned leader, I have a special connection with her.
And see, what's great about Janeway and the Voyager premise is probably the cleverest premise of any of the series.
Agreed.
Just because of the flip-flop of it all, is that the ship that was trapped on the other end of the galaxy is the ship that was least equipped to be there.
Exactly. Yeah, with the crew that was not expecting to be out there that long.
The Intrepid class ship is literally the minivan of the Star. It's tiny. It's meant to go place to place, and they had no science crew. The only balance they had was the captain, who wasn't even a scientist anymore, just had a science background,
right,
and was like their sole source until they had 7 on board.
Exactly. And it's so funny for people who may not have seen the size comparisons. Voyager is tiny. It's mind-blowingly small. But yeah, and then they go through but I love that Janeway gets the opportunity where you can see when she gets excited. Like, they did write her so well that she is a scientist at heart, where there's an opportunity to learn something and contribute. And when I get into, sometimes heated discussions about favorite captains, a lot of the argument against Janeway is like she got diverted so much from going home. But I think she saw it as a responsibility being in this Delta Quadrant where Starfleet had never been before, to document it and to learn things and to actually bring information back home. And, and to the extent that they built the astrometrics lab, which is my, dream home on a starship. But yeah, so good.
Very clever. And I'm also a DS9 fan too. That's my favorite, but I have to give respect to Voyager just for coming up with that major premise.
It is. It's brilliant. But watching Deep Space Nine and really affirming that it is my favorite series, I think so much of it is the amount of behind the scenes downtime you feel when you see them sitting at Quarks and having meals and having conversation. There's so much more of that than there is in the other series. Bashir and O'Brien just playing bar games with each other. And yeah, we had 10 forward and we had mess halls and areas where there was unwinding, but there wasn't nearly that depth of relationships and character building that they did there.
And DS9 was really the only show where you saw people who weren't tasking their life with exploring the universe. You saw people who just wanted to earn a buck or just wanted to, go to school. You saw so many average people on that station, and that gave the depth to the universe that you still haven't seen since, really.
No, not really. And it's because a lot of people, it's really similar, to Babylon 5, which was out at around the same time, but it had I think much more levity and managed to it had a perfect balance of long-term story arcs and then just the single episode stories that I just think the balance is really good. The characters are so good. It's just the best.
So I'm glad you brought up the 90s era of Trek, because there's a book I wanted to ask you about, and you might already know what it is. Do you recall seeing The Physics of Star Trek?
Yes, I have. Yeah, definitely.
I've read it 3 times. I kind of get it. What's your gist on it 20 years out with so much more that we've learned since then?
Oh man, that's really the gist of it, is that how much we have learned and how much our technology has accelerated, that you would think a Physics of Star Trek book that came out 20 years ago, when you watch Voyager and Deep Space Nine, it doesn't feel that aged, but the science is so aged compared to where we are now. You know, one of the things I talk about the most, because I did my PhD in it, was general relativity, and gravitational waves is what I studied. And space-time and general relativity is fundamental to like warp drive. And so even, you know, the strides that we made in the 90s when detecting gravitational waves wasn't even thought of something that could happen. Now we've detected them, you know, 20 years later, and taken us one tiny, tiny step closer to having warp drive. But it's a step. It's just a small one. And even the technology too. You know, Kindles, like I joke, if you look at the original first generation Kindles, those are data pads. Like they're the exact size and just shape of that. Those weren't around, you know, and video conferencing and the internet was there, but nowhere near how it is now. And I think it's amazing. And it's not so much the physics that has advanced, but more the technologies and the applications and the steps that we've taken to get even closer. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Star Trek has continued to inspire generations and generations of scientists and engineers that are contributing to those discoveries. So yeah, I love it. It's crazy. It's just weird that Star Trek doesn't seem to age that much. Caveat, it does age a little bit, but that, you know, but the physics of Star Trek book from the 90s has aged a lot. It's interesting.
So, I mean, from the layman's point of view, the thing I worry about most is not inventing the transporter or the warp drive or the holodeck. I really just can't get my head around ever having a functional inertial dampener. Is there any hope for that?
So I have thought about this so much. So the way I picture the technology of an inertial, so the way that it's kind of been described, and for those of people who might not be aware, right, it's just this idea of with inertia is that your body wants to stay at rest, or if it's moving, it wants to keep moving, which is why we wear seatbelts and all of that. And if your ship is going to go from 0 to faster than the speed of light, it's going to feel some serious inertia. And so therefore, we build inertial dampeners. And the way I visualize how they work conceptually is essentially you would have to have your ship have the interior of the ship somewhat isolated. So almost like a bubble that's running from the outside of the ship, from, you know, the hull of the ship, and then you have the interior, and that there is actually some distance there where they build some sort of bubble. And I mean, you could say too, that might be where they put their gravity generators, because those are never really gone into either.
No.
And so if you have this bubble, you could, in theory, have some sort of material that does better with inertia. It's like a giant, you know, if you go 0 to 60 in your car and you're in a plastic seat, you're going to feel that differently from being in a cushioned seat. So if the ship has some sort of like cushioning that would be able to deal with that. Now, the speeds we're talking about, we don't have any material that's going to help us with that. And I actually, now talking about it, I'm definitely going to sit down and do the calculation for how much, if you had like foam cushions between the hull of the ship and the interior, how big they would need to be to protect from the inertia, because I'm betting it's a lot. I did that calculation with Assassin's Creed, where to figure out how much of a hay bale you would actually need to break your fall from like a hundreds foot tall tower, and it's like 80 of those 100 feet, you know. But anyway, yeah. So you know, and then there's like the non-Newtonian fluids, right? That oobleck, if people have played with like cornstarch and water, where if you punch it, it's solid, it feels solid. But if you slowly insert your hand, you're able to insert your hand. It behaves more like a liquid. And so, I mean, we can give it the catch-all that there's some materials research that goes on out there that is able to react really well to going, you know, even hitting inertial, you know, hitting high speeds and be an inertial dampener. That's my thought. That's a long answer.
No, but I could take that. It's interesting you went into materials and materials research, because I got into this stint where I was reading a lot of really old sci-fi, like Verne era stuff, and the idea that, well, you know, there are some materials that allow light to get through. Maybe there's some materials that allow gravity to get through. and you just got to find the right one, which is silly when you first hear it, and yet it's like, but that's kind of sort of happened in some ways, in that that's been the thought process. Even if we didn't do it, that's how we thought about it.
Right. And I think, the strides that we've made in just studying gravity and how much we've learned about it, there's still schools of thought, is gravity a force? Does it have a force particle associated with it? Or in my opinion, is it just the shape of the universe? And are you able to use mass energy equivalence to somehow, simulate a mass presence that could warp space-time to simulate gravity? But yeah, it's interesting to think about. Speaking of the technology in Star Trek, I think one of the things that cracks me up the most is you can really date science fiction too by some of the technobabble they throw in. And with Star Trek, they really didn't get into it in the shows that much, but in Next Generation, that's where they came out with the technical manual for the Enterprise. And if you look at it, the primary component of the gravity generator is a superconductor. And for me, that really dates to the 80s, because the 80s and 90s were all about the power of superconductors and what they could do. And so throwing that in there is like a nice little shout out, really kind of dates it with what is the cool new technology we're learning about.
Mm-hmm. The Next Gen in general had a lot of those little fringes on there. The Galaxy class ship in general is one that just screams 80s.
Yeah. With love.
But yeah. But still, I actually think the Constitution class aged much better in the grand scheme of things.
I would agree with you on that one for sure.
So we've got the inertial dampeners down. What would be your take on Heisenberg compensators?
I love Heisenberg compensators. They are my favorite thing, honestly. Even though I want to be a warp drive expert and I want to invent warp drive, Heisenberg compensators is the perfect example for what I do, because the reason we can't have transporters is because of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. You can never know exactly where a particle is. The more you know about where it is, there is a limit to it, and the more you know about it, the less you know about its momentum. So, and even then, you're never going to be perfectly knowing exactly where a particle is. And so we can't make transporters, because in order to disassemble someone and rebuild them, whether, out of other material or moving their particles, you still need to know where the particles go. And so Star Trek just recognizes that by saying, we built a Heisenberg compensator as part of the transporter. We fixed it in the future. We acknowledge that Heisenberg is hard, makes transporters difficult and impossible. So now we have a compensator that fixed it. And I love that. I don't even need to get into the details. And that's exactly what I do when I'm dealing with the science fiction stories, like we were talking about, where the science has kind of gone off the rails a little bit, and I'm trying to steer it back on, but we're sacrificing a little bit of story. That we look for opportunities like that to say, you know what, let's just acknowledge that we're breaking science and we're in a science fiction realm, and it's like inertial dampeners too. We give a shout out to the science we're breaking and just leave it there. And I love that.
I mean, it's still, people will get into the science of how do you, what kind of vortex would you need to travel back in time, and what kind of calculations? Well, they just went around the sun backwards, and that's just, they wrapped it up that way. That was a good enough answer at the time.
Right, exactly. And actually one of the better explanations for time travel in Star Trek. There's a modicum of science there compared to, chronotons, which are completely made up time particles.
The idea of a time particle in general, just now that you mentioned, it's just, yeah, okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So where do you see the science going in the future? Where do you think it's going to be a case of the show gets really, the show actually starts basing a lot more around the science, or is it still going to be story driven?
Well, I think it's always going to be story driven. And I think especially with Discovery, what they've done is they've built up so many great characters that we are now very attached to. And they did kind of get themselves, give themselves a lot more license by how season 2 ended, that now they're in the future and they're not tethered to this like weird middle ground of technology that they're trying to somehow marry the technology that they have with where they had in the original series. And so now they're free of that, and they can even, just say, even though we don't have that technology exists out here, in our new point in time. And so I think that they have a lot more liberties that they can play with. Not that stopped them before. Spore Drive comes to mind.
Yeah.
But I think that they're kind of freed up a little bit to play with the technology. And I definitely think it's, there's always going to be, because we're exploring space. That's kind of the fundamental, ethos of Star Trek. So there's always going to be some underlying science to it, even if it's just a throwaway line, some sort of technobabble. But the story's where it's at. The stories are the reason we keep going back and watching Star Trek. We love our characters.
It was a really awkward way for me to ask that, but I actually had a specific example in mind in season 2 with the Red Angel, common thread throughout the whole season. It started out, and most of the season, it was approached like it was some sort of superhuman experience that they were having, and almost like something out of the X-Files.
Yeah,
and then
totally.
As time went on, it's like they started to chip away at us. Like, okay, no, there's some sort of logic here. We can see a pattern. We can see a sense to it. And I thought that was very interesting how they just kind of managed to take something that on the first episode seemed completely unbelievable, and then they added enough background to it.
I really like that take, actually. This idea that it was a very scientific approach to solving that problem. Whether it was whatever it turned out to be, they still approached it as like, let's try to find a pattern. Let's try to find an explanation for this. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I really like that perspective. That's awesome.
Well, thank you. I do. It's one of the things I like to look for in Star Trek is the moments where they kind of have to deal with the fact that even with science and with all the research we've done, there are still just moments of human experience that we can't get our head around.
Yeah.
And sometimes we just have to throw up our hand and say, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think Deep Space Nine probably challenged that the most, with the prophets and Cisco and his sort of fighting his background in his own personal story played a part in a religion that he was not ever a role in or never grew up in or anything. And so trying to, just accept that. And that's where I think, some people get a little burnt out with the Bajoran stories sometimes on Deep Space Nine, because there's so many different kinds of stories where you go from the Dominion War to dealing with the Bajoran religion can kind of be a little bit of whiplash. But I think the way they handled it was always done very well. Kai Wynn is still like my love to hate character number one, that my blood pressure gets up when I see her face, but they're like my favorite episodes. So yeah, it's a blast.
And the key with DS9 was, even with Kai Wynn, who was probably the villain upon villains, there were moments where she was in the right. And most shows wouldn't take that step. And there were, Kira, on the other hand, was the hero and occasionally was in the wrong.
Yeah.
It was a subtlety you just didn't often see anywhere else.
Yeah, I had a really interesting discussion at Dragon Con one time about Kai Wynn, and it really changed my perspective because we were all venting about, the love to hate villain on villain, just Kai Wynn, man. And then someone mentioned, they were like, well, do you think that maybe the prophets intentionally ignored Kai Wynn to drive her to the Pa Wraiths and like fulfill, the story? And just one of the person's reaction was like, I'm not supposed to feel sympathy for Kai Wynn. Like, I refuse this explanation. Because, you love to hate her.
I'm still a Dukat fan when all is said and done.
Really?
Yes, very much so.
That's funny. Yeah, no, Garrick is my number one Cardassian for sure.
I can agree with that, because with Garrick, there would be times he would help you, but he was helping you today because it worked for his advantage. Tomorrow is a different story.
Exactly. I always love when he said to Bashir about, when Bashir was telling him about the boy who cried wolf, and he was like, well, what am I supposed to get out of that? And he's like, you can't lie. He's like, no, just don't tell the same lie twice. It's amazing. I love it. I love it.
Well, I should start wrapping up so that I'm sure you have a lot to do. But where can somebody find you if they want to catch you online?
Yes, please. So I'm most easily found on Twitter. It's at Dr. Erin Mac, Dr. Erin Mac. That's where I post it's either space or science fiction is what you'll find there. And that's also where I post some of my appearances. You can also find my website is www.erinpmacdonald.com. That's Macdonald with an A. And that's where I'll post, like this podcast and links to all the other sort of videos and interviews and articles and everything that I've done from there. And if you want me to come to your local Comic-Con or, science fiction convention and talk about the science behind science fiction, let your organizers know, because I love doing this stuff.
I can think of a few in the area. I could drop your name and see what happens.
Please do. Yes. I love it.
Well, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I would love to have you back anytime.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Have a good one. Live long and prosper.
Live long and prosper.